From Black Awakening in Capitalist America Editor's Note, this is an excerpt from Robert L. Allen's classic Black Awakening in Capitalist America. Readers will note that it assumes knowledge of events from the Black Power era. Also, most of his sources are not cited. Nevertheless, nearly 4 decades later, Allen's analysis of the Ford Foundation's impact on the Black Power movement is prophetic and sufficiently clear to audiences today that we are including this excerpt as it appeared in 1969. Departures from the original are indicated in brackets. The year 1967, wrote James Forman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, marked a historic milestone in the struggle for the liberation of Black people in the United States, and the year that revolutionaries throughout the world began to understand more fully the impact of the Black movement. Our liberation will only come when there is final destruction of this mad octopus, the capitalistic system of the United States, with all its life-sucking tentacles of exploitation and racism that choke the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. There can be little doubt that Forman was right in pointing to 1967 as an important turning point in the history of Black America. It was a year of unprecedented, massive, and widespread urban revolts. It was the year that so-called riots became an institutionalized form of Black protest. Attempts to build Black United Fronts were taking place around the country. There was the Black United Front of Washington, D.C., the North City Congress in Philadelphia, the United Front in Boston, the Black United Conference in Denver, and the Black Congress in Los Angeles. These were coalitions which sought to alter power relations in the cities where they existed to establish some measure of Black control or influence in those cities. They also faced the same dangers of manipulation and co-optation. They had to come to grips with the threat of gradual takeover by more conservative Blacks who have little desire to serve the community. The simple but unfortunate fact is that the militants are usually less well organized than the Urban League, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, preachers, teachers, and social workers who are invited to participate in them. Consequently, it is relatively easy for these representatives of the privileged Black bourgeoisie to take control of organizations ostensibly dedicated to militant reform, to enabling Black people to assume control over their own lives. If this process of takeover goes unchecked, the United Front is transformed into an instrumentality serving the interests of the Black middle class alone. The needs of the popular Black masses go by the board, and a new oppressive elite assumes power. It is only to the extent that the United Front serve the needs and aspirations of the great bulk of Black people that they can be regarded as progressive organizations. To the extent that they fall in the hands of a privileged and opportunistic elite, they become simply an added burden strapped to the back of Black America. The ouster of Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell from the House of Representatives prompted the Congress for Racial Equality to concretize its interest in electoral politics. On January 16, 1967, Floyd McKissick issued a call for a conference to create a national Black political structure. No political machinery now in existence, he said, is available to us through which our just hopes and aspirations can be achieved. He told reporters that the proposed structure would be an apparatus, not a party. This apparatus would assist CORE in deciding whether to support the Democratic or Republican parties or develop an independent platform which it will attempt to sell to the Democrats or Republicans. McKissick added that Black people were moving toward bloc voting throughout the United States. He said that both national political parties had failed Blacks, and he sought to elevate the Black man to a state of equality in the decision-making processes of government. He expressed the hope that the proposed political structure would become a formidable bloc by the time of the 1968 national elections. Thus, CORE was in the contradictory position of espousing greater Black involvement in electoral politics, even though it was precisely in this sphere with the humiliating ouster of Powell that Black people had just suffered a significant political defeat. But the temptations of electoral politics were too great to be denied. The proposed conference never took place, but CORE and its tacit ally, the Black Power Conference, moved progressively closer to becoming little more than political lobbies advocating reforms, taking whatever political crumbs they could garner for themselves. CORE was to take other curious turns, and eventually ally itself with an arm of the very power structure which it claimed to be fighting. Early in 1967, the Ford Foundation made grants of several $100,000 to the NAACP and the Urban League. A few months later, the foundation gave $1 million to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's new National Office for the Rights of Indigents. But for the purpose of urban pacification, these groups were less than satisfactory, since there was serious doubt as to how much control they exercised over the young militants and frustrated ghetto blacks who were likely to be heaving Molotov cocktails during the summer. If its efforts to keep the lids on the cities were to succeed, the foundation had to find some way to penetrate militant organizations which were believed to wield some influence over the angry young blacks who were trapped in the urban chaos. The first move in this direction occurred in May 1967, when the foundation granted $500,000 to the Metropolitan Applied Research Center, a newly created organization in New York with a militant-sounding program headed by Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, a psychology professor who at one time was associated with Harlem's anti-poverty program. When it was organized the previous March, Mark announced that its purpose was to pioneer in research and action on behalf of the powerless urban poor in northern metropolitan areas. Clark's strategy was to get the large corporations involved in the ghetto. "Business and industry are our last hope," he once remarked. "They are the most realistic elements of our society." Interestingly, in a brochure, Mark compared itself with the semi-governmental RAND Corporation, which does research for the Air Force. The difference between the two, according to the brochure, is that Mark is not associated with the government, nor is it limited to research. It is also an action organization. One of Mark's first actions was to name Roy Innis, then chairman of CORE's militant Harlem chapter, as its first civil rights fellow in residence. The May 11th announcement also stated that the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Reverend Andrew Young, one of King's chief aides, had agreed to take part in the fellowship program. Innis received a 6-month fellowship. "The Civil Rights Fellowships," wrote the New York Times on May 12th, "are designed to give the leaders an opportunity to evaluate their programs and tactics and undertake long-range planning." Mark's staff was to aid the leaders in their studies, and the fellows were to draw salaries equal to those they received from their organizations or from private employment. Clark said he had also discussed fellowships with Floyd McKissick, National Director of CORE, Stokely Carmichael, then Chairman of SNCC, Whitney Young of the Urban League, and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. Mark's next move was to call a secret meeting of civil rights leaders for May 27th. Subsequently, another such meeting was held June 13th at a Suffern, New York, motel among Clark and leaders of 9 major civil rights groups. At the conclusion of that meeting, Clark announced a joint effort to calm Cleveland's racial tension. He said the underlying causes of unrest and despair among urban ghetto Negroes, as well as clear indications of their grim, sobering, and costly consequences, are found in classic form in Cleveland. What Clark did not mention was that the Ford Foundation had been trying to calm Cleveland since 1961 by financing various local research and action projects. But despite this joint effort, Cleveland blew up in 1966, and further serious rumblings were heard in the early spring of 1967. Clearly, a new approach was needed in Cleveland, and the stage was set for the Ford Foundation's first direct grant to a militant group, the Cleveland chapter of CORE. The foundation announced on July 14th that it was giving $175,000 to the Special Purposes Fund of CORE to be used for training of Cleveland youth and adult community workers, voter registration efforts, exploration of economic development programs, and attempts to improve program planning among civil rights groups. In explaining the grant, McGeorge Bundy said that foundation staff and consultants had been investigating Cleveland for some months. In fact, he said, it was predictions of new violence in the city that led to our first staff visits in March. Apparently realizing that the grant might give the impression of a close relationship developing between the foundation and CORE, Bundy added, "The national officers of CORE have dealt with us on this matter in a businesslike way, and neither Mr. Floyd McKissick nor I supposes that this grant requires the two of us or our organizations to agree on all public questions. It does require us both to work together in support of the peaceful and constructive efforts of CORE's Cleveland leadership, and that is what we plan to do." It must be said that CORE was vulnerable to such corporate penetration. In the first place, they needed money. Floyd McKissick in 1966 had become national director of an organization which was several $100,000 in debt. An espousal of Black power scared away potential financial supporters. Second, CORE's militant rhetoric, but ambiguous and reformist definition of Black power as simply Black control of Black communities appealed to Foundation officials who were seeking just those qualities in a Black organization which hopefully could tame the ghettos. From the Foundation's point of view, old-style moderate leaders no longer exercised any real control, while genuine Black radicals were too dangerous. CORE the bill, because its talk about Black revolution was believed to appeal to discontented Blacks, while its program of achieving Black power through massive injections of governmental, business, and Foundation aid seemingly opened the way for continued corporate domination of Black communities by means of a new Black elite. Surprisingly, to some, CORE's program as elaborated by Floyd McKissick in July 1967 was quite similar to approach. Both organizations see themselves as intermediaries whose role was to negotiate with the power structure on behalf of Blacks and the poor generally. Both suggested that more government and private aid was necessary, and both sought to gain admission for poor Blacks and whites into the present economic and political structure of U.S. society. McKissick, who became the second CORE official to accept a Mark Fellowship, criticized capitalism, but only because Black people were not allowed to participate fully in it. Within a few months, the Ford Foundation could apparently view its grant to Cleveland CORE as a qualified success. There was no rebellion in Cleveland in the summer of 1967, and in November, Carl Stokes became the first Negro mayor of a major American city, a fact which temporarily eased tensions in the ghettos. "We are not satisfied with the speed with which the program has moved," said James Cunningham, a consultant retained by the Foundation to monitor the project, "but it has shown real potential. I see it as a flowering of what Black power could be." The first phase of the project was an intensive voter registration drive in 3 slum wards in August. This was followed by a voter education program to instruct Black people on voting procedures and to get them to the polls. This program included mailings and meetings with candidates. The net result of this phase of the program was to aid in the election of Carl Stokes, a fact of which Cleveland CORE boasted in its report on the project. Another part of the program, designated as a youth leadership training program, began in November. In all, some 62 youths, ranging in age from 17 to 21, were involved in this project. The project was designed, according to the CORE report, to identify and train urban ghetto youth in those skills which can serve as an alternative to frustration and violence. To this end, the youngsters attended classes on Black history, African history, and social science. They were taught skills in canvassing, interviewing, and recording community opinions. There was apparently little discussion of who would ever read their interviews and reports of community sentiment. Some of the staff were taken on visits to Black-owned businesses in Chicago. In short, youths who had no faith in the system were taught that if only they could re-socialize themselves, they might fit in after all. The director of the youth training program, Philip Carter, said his project hoped to show that the legitimate hostilities and aggressions of Black youth could be programmed into socially acceptable channels. He expressed the hope that the youths being trained would become young Black urban renewal specialists, young Black sociologists, and young Black political scientists. He did not say and did not need to say in whose interest these young Black experts would be put to work. The mere fact that there aren't any genuinely Black-controlled educational institutions guarantees that if they are to work, they must work in the interest of continued white domination of every facet of Black life. Militant rhetoric was used to cover up the cooptative nature of this project. "Our job as an organization," said Arthur Evans, a member of Cleveland CORE and national first vice chairman of the organization, "is to prepare people to make a decision on revolution or not. The choice is whether to take land and resources and redistribute them. The evidence of this suggests that CORE decided against revolution." This militant rhetoric deceived no one, least of all those who financed the project. In his annual report for 1967, McGeorge Bundy dismissed the preachers of hate as so much spume on the wave of the past, but he concluded that no one who has dealt honestly with legitimately militant black leaders will confuse their properly angry words with any conspiracy to commit general violence. So much for Mr. Evans's cagey talk about revolution. Unfortunately for Bundy, legitimately militant black leaders do not necessarily speak for or represent anyone but themselves. The violence which hit Cleveland the next year should have amply demonstrated this fact. Developments at CORE's convention in Oakland, California, early in the month of July 1967, provide further insight into that organization's strategy. One of the most important events at that meeting was the presentation of an impressive 12-page report by Roy Innis's Harlem chapter. The report gave a summary of Harlem CORE's program for the gaining of control or the creation of institutions in our community. We call this, the report stated, a program of separate but not segregated institutions. In the area of economics, the report announced that Innis, as chapter chairman, had joined with a group of young black men in Harlem in organizing a small business investment corporation that will have a broad-based stockhold, ING membership. The organization was to be known as the Harlem Commonwealth Council, Inc., and Innis became a member of its board of directors. Referring to HCC, the report continued, money will be raised in the black community that will be matched 2-to-1 by small business loans, and this money will be used to invest in or to create businesses in Harlem or possibly light industry. Thus Harlem CORE was pioneering and formulating a strategy for the rise of black capitalism. In the field of education, Harlem CORE reported that in March it has launched its demand for black control of the schools in Harlem by proposing the creation of an independent board of education for Harlem selected and completely controlled by and responsible to the black people of Harlem. According to the proposal, integration had failed, and the only way to achieve quality education for Harlem's youngsters was through community control of its schools. Harlem CORE set up a committee for autonomous Harlem School District and began organizing support for the proposal. Almost local districts. Bundy had been named head of a special committee on decentralization at the end of April after the state legislature directed Mayor Lindsay to submit a decentralization plan by December 1st if the city were to qualify for more state aid. Lindsay, an astute political liberal, insisted that decentralization was not merely an administrative or budgetary device, but a means to advance the quality of education for all our children and a method of ensuring community participation and achieving that goal. Bundy's proposal would allow for not one, but possibly several school boards for Harlem. Harlem CORE's school board committee therefore found itself in the position of being on the same side as the New York Times in giving critical support to the Bundy plan, while both the New York City Board of Education and the United Federation of Teachers opposed it. Bundy and the Times saw that decentralization could be modified and applied in a manner that would not seriously change the overall functioning of the educational system, while the UFT was so blindly engrossed in immediate problems that it failed to realize that its long-term interests lay neither with the school board nor in the course proposed by Bundy. Tension between teachers and black parents had risen as a result of a 3-week teachers' strike that fall. The teachers thought parents were attempting to usurp their professional rights and privileges. The parents, on the other hand, attacked the teachers as racists and the destroyers of their children. Bundy was well aware of this escalating tension while writing his report Reconnection for Learning. But he also knew that the teachers had in their union an established mechanism for channeling their discontent. The parents had no such channel, and there was always the danger that their anger, having no institutionalized outlet, might escalate into violence. Hence it was an urgent necessity for the parents in some way to be reconnected to the schools if disruptive conflict were to be avoided. The mechanism for accomplishing this end appeared to be limited school decentralization, which would allow some parent participation, thereby mitigating dangerous clashes while at the same time precluding genuine community control of the schools by masking control under a new facade. CORE's Oakland meeting was shaken briefly by a rebellion of dissident nationalists who thought that the strategy of separate community institutions was too limited in scope. The nationalists wanted CORE to endorse complete separation of blacks from white America. They sought to have the organization approve the idea of a separate black state. They also wanted CORE to exclude white members. On this latter point, a compromise was reached, and the convention agreed to strike the word multiracial from the section of the organization's constitution that describes its membership. White liberals loudly decried this compromise. The New York Times, for example, lamented editorially that white co-strugglers have been given a clear message that they will be relegated to SEC on-class citizenship within the organization. To put it bluntly, CORE membership now stands for racial inequality. CORE, however, was no longer attuned to this traditional white liberal view of the meaning of racial equality. In the second half of the 60s, having a quota of white members was no longer required to legitimatize a black freedom organization. The programmatic thrust of the CORE convention was outlined a few weeks later by McKissick. The occasion of his remarks, McKissick denounced the statement condemning riots issued by Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young. Their statement approved violent repression of riots and said in part, "Killing, arson, looting are criminal acts and should be dealt with as such. Equally guilty are those who incite, provoke, and call specifically for such actions. There is no injustice which justifies the present destruction of the Negro community." McKissick replied that history would record the ghetto explosions that summer as the beginning of the Black Revolution and as rebellions against repression and exploitation. In a tactfully worded statement, McKissick accused the four civil rights leaders of opportunism. "We believe that it is unfortunate that our brothers felt it necessary to condemn black men for rebelling against that which oppresses, that they found it opportune to decry the violence of the victim. It is fruitless to condemn without offering solutions, and it can only force black people to question those who condemn. We wouldn't have the violence if someone hadn't made some mistakes," said the CORE leader. He then went on to outline CORE's program for correcting these mistakes. Some of his specific proposals sounded remarkably like what Harlem CORE had recommended. Black people seek to control the educational system, the political economic system, and the administration of their own communities. Ownership of the land area in places such as Harlem must be transferred to the residents of Harlem individually or collectively. Existing governmental programs, such as the Demonstration Cities program, the Federal Housing Authority, the Commerce Department programs, along with the contributions from private industry, must be coordinated to accomplish this end. Ownership of businesses in the ghetto must be transferred to black people either individually or collectively. These paragraphs suggest certain economic changes, but they leave unanswered the critical question of in whose interest is economic power to be exercised. Simple transference of business ownership into black hands, either individually or collectively, is in itself no guarantee that this will benefit the total community. Blacks are capable of exploiting one another just as easily as whites. It was this ambiguity, however, that opened the way for CORE to move toward black capitalism. What had begun as a Harlem CORE project was now shaping up as the overall strategy of National CORE. Black power was slowly but relentlessly coming to be equated with the power of black business. This despite the fact that black business had never been a powerful social entity. Most ghetto businesses tend to be marginal operations such as beauty salons, barbershops, small grocery stores, and other retail and service businesses. In 1967, 1/4 of all businesses in Harlem, for example, were black-owned, but in all of New York City only a dozen or so black-owned or managed enterprises employed more than 10 people. The history of black business in the U.S. fails to disclose any significant venture in steel, automobiles, telephone, railroads, and most other industrial fields. The white corporate oligopoly has excluded blacks from the mainstream of American corporate endeavor, except in certain areas of banking, insurance, and publishing. But in at least 2 of these areas, the black businessman is largely fighting a rearguard action. In 1948, the National Negro Insurance Association could claim to have 62 member companies with assets of over $108 million. As of 1963, the Negro Handbook listed 89 black insurance firms, with total assets of only $26 million. The top 10 white firms alone claimed assets of over $100 billion in 1967. As for banks, in February 1969, Dempsey J. Travis, president of an association of Negro mortgage bankers, told a conference that the number of black-owned commercial banks, for instance, had declined to 20 in 19 cities from 49 in 38 cities in 1929. There is very little that would suggest any reversal of these overall trends. Moreover, in cities where a significant black business class exists, it usually is a conservative force rather than a militant one advocating for the massive restructuring of the U.S. economic system. The proposed CORE program tried to reverse the general downward trend and create new and expanded black businesses by demanding that existing white-controlled economic enterprises be transferred to black ownership. However, such a transfer could alter economic realities in the ghetto only if ownership and control of business activities became collective and community-wide. Individual ownership or limited stock corporations restrict effective control to a narrowly circumscribed class of persons within the black community. If the community as a whole is to benefit, then the community as a whole must be organized to manage collectively its internal economy and its business relations with white America. Black business firms must be treated and operated as social property belonging to the general black community, not as the private property of individuals or limited groups of individuals. This necessitates the dismantling of capitalist property relations in the black community and their replacement with a planned communal economy. But CORE had no intention of tampering with the free enterprise system. McKissick chose to ignore the ramifications of these considerations in his anxiety to project CORE as the most prominent and serious organization in the militant black movement. CORE, he concluded his statement, stands ready to serve as a coordinating agent to assist all black people of any philosophy. Subtly addressing himself to those with money to spend and who want to put out the flames in the cities, he contended that if CORE's programs were adequately funded and fully implemented, then it just might be possible to alter the future of America from its present self-destructive course. In summary, CORE and the cultural nationalists drape themselves in the mantle of nationalism, but upon examination it is seen that their programs, far from aiding in the achievement of black liberation and freedom from exploitation, would instead weld the black communities more firmly into the structure of American corporate capitalism. The reformist or bourgeois nationalism through its chosen vehicle of black capitalism may line the pockets and boost the social status of the black middle class and black intelligentsia, but it will not ease the oppression of the ordinary ghetto dweller. What CORE and the cultural nationalists seek is not an end to oppression, but the transfer of the oppressive apparatus into their own hands. They call themselves nationalists and exploit the legitimate nationalist feelings of black people in order to advance their own interests as a class. And chief among those interests is their desire to become brokers between the white rulers and the black ruled. Note,